On a bitterly cold winter night, a lone man caught sight of two wolves silently lurking at the edge of his property. But instead of baring their fangs or growling, these majestic yet haunting creatures appeared desperate, scraping at his door, as if pleading for sanctuary. When he finally opened that door, he had no way of knowing the life-altering moment that awaited him. What drove these frozen wolves to seek refuge in a human's home, rather than endure the wild they were born to? Conquer? Warren Pierce had spent his entire life in the remote Alaskan wilderness, where brutal winters were a way of life. His sturdy log cabin, weathered by years of unforgiving storms, stood as a testament to his resilience. He was no stranger to bone-chilling winds and sub-zero nights. Yet, despite his rugged experience, nothing could have prepared him for what he saw that fateful evening. It had been an ordinary day, or as ordinary as a day could be in the dead of winter. Warren had chopped enough firewood to last through the night and checked on his small greenhouse, which clung to survival thanks to a single heater. As dusk fell, he settled indoors, content to spend the long, dark hours by his crackling fireplace, a mug of hot tea warming his hands. Then came a sound, a faint, persistent scratching at his front door, followed by soft, desperate whimpers that cut through the silence of the night. At first, he assumed it was a stray dog, perhaps a feral canine from the outskirts of town. But when he peered through the frost-laced window, his pulse quickened. Two wolves stood on his porch, their once proud coats matted and dusted with snow, their breath misting in the freezing air. They weren't snarling, nor did they bear the stance of predators. They trembled from the cold, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. One even mustered a weak, mournful howl, an eerie plea for help. Warren's instincts clashed with his caution. Wolves were wild hunters, unpredictable and formidable. But these creatures didn't radiate menace. They radiated desperation. Against every logical impulse, he grabbed a flashlight and cautiously cracked open the door. One of the wolves, the smaller of the two, took a shaky step forward. Its glowing eyes weren't filled with hostility, but with a pleading intensity that stirred something deep within him. In that moment, any fear Warren felt was eclipsed by an overwhelming sense of compassion. What had driven these creatures to seek shelter from a human? And if he let them in, was he inviting danger into his home? He took a measured breath and made his decision. Wincing against the icy wind, Warren opened the door wider and gestured for them to come inside. The wolves exchanged a glance, if it could even be called that, before cautiously padding forward, their weary paws leaving faint imprints in the snow. The moment their fur met the cabin's warmth, a shudder rippled through their bodies as, though shedding the weight of the brutal cold they had endured. Once inside, the wolves stood still, their breath audible in the hushed warmth of the cabin. They sniffed the air, their luminous eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. Warren moved, carefully, mindful not to startle them, as he added another log to the fire. The flames crackled, casting long shadows against the walls, filling the cabin with a golden glow. As the warmth seeped into their bones, the wolves visibly relaxed. One, a smaller wolf with a patch of gray across its back, limped slightly, favoring its hind leg. Its ribs jutted out beneath its fur, a stark testament to its struggle against starvation. The other, slightly larger, with a deep scar along its muzzle, moved with slow dignity, its golden eyes watchful yet devoid of hostility. Warren couldn't ignore the pang of sympathy twisting inside him. How long had it been since they'd last eaten? The frozen wilderness was merciless, and for an injured wolf, survival was an impossible battle. He rummaged through his pantry, eventually pulling out raw cuts of meat meant for his own meals. Hesitating only for a moment, he set the food on the floor and stepped back. The smaller wolf approached first, sniffing cautiously before taking a tentative bite. The larger followed, and together they devoured the offering within seconds. Their eyes now flickering with something close to relief, met Warren's for a fleeting moment. He had earned a fraction of their trust. As the hours passed, an unspoken understanding settled between them. Warren remained near the fire, flipping through an old book, while the wolves dozed fitfully, their ears twitching at the wind howling. Beyond the cabin walls, at one point, the larger wolf whimpered in its sleep, paws twitching as if lost in a dream. Warren felt an unexpected urge to reach out and soothe it, but he refrained, respecting the delicate boundary between them. By the time dawn broke, the storm outside had calmed, but a new concern gnawed at Warren's mind. The smaller wolf's limp had worsened. He knelt beside it, extending his hand with deliberate slowness. The wolf tensed, but didn't recoil. Gently, Warren placed his fingers against its injured leg. It flinched, emitting a soft growl of pain, but did not snap. Swelling. Perhaps frostbite or an old wound aggravated by the harsh elements. "I'll do what I can," he murmured, as though the wolf could understand. From the corner of the cabin, the larger wolf's amber eyes tracked his every move, tension evident in its rigid stance. Warren knew this was a test of trust. One wrong move, and he could easily end up on the receiving end of powerful jaws. But he moved with care, cleaning the wound with a damp cloth, applying antiseptic, and wrapping the leg in soft gauze. The injured wolf trembled, its breaths uneven, but it allowed him to continue. When he finally pulled away, the wolf exhaled, a long breath, the sound almost like a sigh of relief. Warren sat back, a strange warmth filling his chest. This was no ordinary night. This was no ordinary encounter. He had invited the wild into his home, but in doing so, he had discovered something unexpected, an unspoken bond, a fragile truce forged in the heart of winter's merciless grip. And in that silent, flickering firelight, man and beast found a moment of understanding neither had ever known before. As Warren loaded the last of the firewood onto the sled, a thought nagged at the back of his mind. What if the wolves' pack came searching for them? He paused, surveying the silent wilderness. The land stretched endlessly before him, breathtaking yet unforgiving. He imagined the smaller wolf limping through the deep snow, wounded and starving, pushed to the brink of desperation. The thought strengthened his resolve. No creature should suffer alone. Back at the cabin, the warmth of the fire greeted him. The wolves lay near the hearth, the smaller one licking at its bandaged leg, looking better than before. The larger wolf, ever watchful, lifted its head as Warren entered. He unloaded the wood, stoking the flames until heat seeped into his frozen fingers. He unwrapped a portion of his dwindling meat supply, setting it on a plate on the floor. The wolves, wary but hungry, approached cautiously. As they ate, he couldn't ignore the surreal nature of the situation. 2 wild wolves sharing his home, yet he felt no fear, only a growing bond built on mutual survival. Hours later, the cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm. Warren dozed in, his chair, firelight casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. The wolves rested on makeshift blankets, occasionally rising to lap at the bowl of water he'd placed nearby. He knew he should call a ranger or a wildlife specialist, but the thought unsettled him. What if they took the wolves away? What if they saw them as a threat and decided they were better off dead? Conflict churned inside him, but he decided to wait. One more day, just long enough to see if they regained their strength and left on their own. As night fell, the wind howled against the cabin. Inside, the warm glow of the fire remained a steady beacon against the darkness. Warren paced, restless. The wolves watched him, their eyes quiet and knowing. It felt as if they understood his turmoil. He sank back into his chair, exhaling deeply. What would morning bring? Would they leave, returning to the life they were meant for? Or would they stay, forging a connection neither of them had expected? Dawn arrived with a fragile light spreading across the snow-covered land. Warren stirred from sleep, stretching. Something felt off. He glanced toward the fireplace. The larger wolf was no longer there. A spike of worry shot through him. Had it slipped outside during the night? Was it wandering the freezing wilderness alone? A low growl from the corner of the cabin sent a chill down his spine. He turned. The larger wolf stood stiffly over its injured companion, ears flattened, hackles raised. But it wasn't looking at Warren. It was staring at the door, heart pounding. Warren moved cautiously to the window. Outside, in the pale morning light, something shifted near the tree line. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned in, trying to make out the figure. At first, he thought it was another animal, a moose or maybe a bear. But then, from behind a thick pine, a human silhouette emerged. Adrenaline surged through him. He rarely had visitors, especially in the dead of winter. Grabbing his coat and a flashlight, he pressed an ear to the door. The larger wolf's growl deepened. Whoever was out there, the animal sensed danger. Warren took a breath and cracked the door open. A rush of icy wind swept inside. The figure had moved out of sight, but fresh footprints in the snow led around the side of the cabin. His nerves taut, he stepped outside, following the tracks. "Hello?" His voice cut through the cold air. "If you need help, say something." No answer. Only the howling wind. He took another step, eyes scanning the woods. Then, movement near the woodpile. Caution warred with curiosity. Was someone in trouble? Or did they mean harm? Just as he was about to turn back, a voice startled him. "Are they inside?" He spun around. A woman stood a few feet away, bundled in a thick parka, her hood and scarf concealing most of her face. Only her eyes were visible, sharp, determined and filled with urgency. Warren raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Who are you?" "I'm hunting those wolves," she said matter-of-factly. His stomach tightened. "Hunting them?" She exhaled, her breath forming a small cloud. "Not like that," she clarified, sensing his alarm. "I'm with a wildlife rehabilitation group. We've been tracking this pack for weeks. These two got separated in the storm. They won't survive out here alone." Relief flooded him, though suspicion lingered. Then why sneak around instead of knocking on my door? She hesitated before admitting, "I had to be sure they were here. People can be unpredictable when it comes to wolves." Warren studied her. He couldn't deny she had a point. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come inside. Move slowly. They're still wary." Inside, the larger wolf let out a low bark, positioning itself protectively. The woman crouched, extending her hands, palms up. "Hey there, big guy," she murmured soothingly. "I'm a friend." Her tone was practiced, calming. The larger wolf hesitated but didn't lunge. Warren watched, intrigued. "My name's Kara," she said over her shoulder. "I'm a researcher at North Ridge Wildlife Center. We've been monitoring their pack. The smaller one, she's young, likely injured in a trap or a fight. The bigger one? Probably her brother. He wouldn't leave her behind." Warren exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. "You're taking them back with you?" Kara nodded. "If you're okay with that." He glanced at the wolves, a strange pang twisting in his chest. He had grown attached in such a short time, but he knew what had to be done. "It's what's best for them, right?" he asked quietly. "It is," Kara assured him gently. "Once she's healed, we'll release them back to their pack." That night, the cabin felt different. Less like a sanctuary and more like a temporary refuge. The wolves, calmer now, lay side by side near the fire. Kara watched them with quiet admiration. Most wolves wouldn't trust a human like this, she mused. "You did something incredible here." Warren flushed. "I just couldn't let them die." She nodded. and they knew that. Morning arrived too soon. Kara stepped outside to radio her team, leaving Warren alone with the wolves for one final moment. He crouched beside them, running a hand over the thick fur of the larger one. "You're going home," he murmured. The wolf didn't flinch, didn't move, just met his gaze with an understanding that transcended words. And in that moment, Warren knew he would never forget them. A stronger scent of coffee filled the cabin as Warren set a fresh pot to brew, the rich aroma cutting through the crisp, morning air. The wolves stirred, blinking sluggishly. The smaller one, its bandaged leg still swollen, seemed marginally better. Warren quietly set down a bowl of fresh water, marveling at how natural it felt to care for these wild creatures. When Kara returned, her face was a mix of relief and urgency. "They're sending help," she announced. "2 of my team members will meet us about 3 miles from here, near a frozen creek. If we can get the wolves there, they'll handle the rest." Warren nodded. "Then we need to move fast. The snowmobile can take us all if we're careful." Together, they prepared for departure. They fashioned a makeshift sled, layering it with blankets so the injured wolf could rest comfortably. The larger wolf sniffed at the sled warily but didn't resist. It seemed to sense that this was necessary. The real challenge was getting the wolves outside and onto the sled. Warren went first, opening the door to reveal a world blanketed in white. A cold wind rushed in, rustling the wolves' fur. Kara spoke softly, her voice soothing as she coaxed them forward. The smaller wolf whimpered when lifted, but the bandages and ointment must have eased the pain. It didn't resist too much. Larger wolf climbed onto the sled on its own, curling protectively around its sibling. With the wolves secured, Warren mounted the snowmobile, and Kara settled behind him, clutching a radio. The engine roared to life, shattering the eerie silence of the snow-covered expanse. As they pulled away from the cabin, Warren felt a strange pang. Part of him didn't want to leave this place where humans and wolves had coexisted so unexpectedly. But this journey was necessary for the wolves' survival and maybe even for his own. The snowmobile carved a steady path through the untouched snow, its growl the only sound in the vast, frozen landscape. Warren kept a firm grip on the handlebars while Kara monitored the sled. Inside, the wolves huddled close, the smaller one's bandaged leg tucked beneath it. The larger wolf wrapped itself around its sibling, protective and alert. "We should reach the creek in about 30 minutes, Kara said, glancing at her GPS. "The team is expecting us." The journey felt both too short and perilously long. Though the sun cast a pale light over the land, the Alaskan winter remained unforgiving. A stiff breeze kicked up flurries of snow, biting at any exposed skin. The radio crackled intermittently, distorted by the dense forest and towering mountains. "They said they'd meet us in an hour," Kara called over the wind. "We need to keep up our pace." Warren nodded, focusing on guiding the snowmobile around. Hidden obstacles. The larger wolf's ears twitched at every bump, but it seemed to trust that Warren and Kara meant no harm. Then, the sky shifted. Steel-gray clouds gathered on the horizon, a silent warning. Warren clenched his jaw. Traveling in a snowstorm with injured animals was a risk he had hoped to avoid. "We need to move faster," he said. Kara tapped his shoulder in agreement, bracing herself for the ride ahead. The sled bounced over ridges of packed snow, sending powdery flurries over the wolves. They whimpered, but remained still, instinctively understanding that this was their best chance. The trees thickened, and visibility dropped as branches laden with snow formed a near-impenetrable canopy. Warren navigated carefully, weaving between trunks and over icy patches. One wrong move could upend the sled. "We should be close," Kara said, checking her GPS. "The creek should be just ahead." They emerged into a clearing, where the frozen creek gleamed under the faint sunlight. It looked like a road of glass, marred only by the wind-blown snow. Kara pointed. We need to cross here. My team should be on the far side. Warren eased the snowmobile onto the ice, testing its strength. It groaned under the weight, but held. Halfway across, the radio crackled to life. Kara, this is Dan. We're coming in from the east, but the storm's moving faster than we thought. If it hits before we reach you, you may need to hunker down. Kara exchanged a worried look with Warren. Copy that, Dan. We're almost across. Where exactly will you be? Look for a red marker on a pine. We'll set up shelter there. As if on cue, the wind intensified, howling across the ice and reducing visibility to nearly nothing. The wolves let out uneasy whines. The smaller one shivered, whether from fear or cold, Warren couldn't tell. Kara placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Just a little further. We'll find that marker. At last, Warren spotted a splash of red through the swirling snow. Relief flooded him as he steered toward it. Under the marked tree, two bundled figures fought against the wind, securing a tarp against the storm. A small fire flickered weakly nearby. As they pulled up, the figures waved. Kara jumped off. We found them! They're stable, but the smaller one has a leg injury. Dan, a tall man with a salt and pepper beard, nodded grimly. Let's get them inside. His companion, a woman named Nina, hurried to spread blankets under the shelter. Storm's about to hit us hard. We need to move fast. Carefully, they guided the wolves from the sled. The larger one growled low when Dan approached, but Kara's presence kept it calm. The smaller wolf, exhausted, allowed Nina to guide it to the warmth of the blankets. Warren hovered nearby, reluctant to let them go. These wolves had been under his care, and now they were in expert hands. A strange pang of loss crept into his chest. Sensing his hesitation, Kara glanced up from tending to the smaller wolf's leg. They'll get the best care, she reassured him. And when they're ready, we'll figure out a way to release them. Maybe you could even be there. Warren exhaled, then nodded. I'd like that. Outside, the wind raged on, rattling the shelter. But inside, there was warmth. Not just from the fire, but from something deeper. A bond forged in the wild between man and creature, bound by trust and survival. And as Warren sat beside the wolves watching over them through the long, stormy night, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of their story. Warren's breath came in ragged clouds as he trudged through the snow, his boots crunching against the frozen earth. The wind howled around him, carrying the scent of pine and the distant echo of wolves. His heart pounded, not from the cold, but from the urgency of the moment. He gripped the radio tighter. Kara, I found them! Static crackled before her voice, broke through. Are they alive? He crouched beside the mother wolf, her white fur matted with blood, her sides rising and falling in weak, labored breaths. Her pups, tiny, fragile things, huddled against her belly, whimpering. Their wide, fearful eyes locked onto Warren, pleading without words. His throat tightened. Barely. The mother's hurt bad. The pups, they won't survive out here. A deep, primal sorrow settled in his chest. He had spent years tracking wolves, understanding them, respecting their untamed existence. Yet, he had never been this close, never felt this responsible. Warren, we don't have much time, Kara urged. A storm's rolling in. He exhaled sharply, looking at the mother wolf. He knew the risks. If he moved her, he might worsen her injuries. If he left her, she'd die alone in the snow, and her pups wouldn't last the night. The wild was merciless. I'm bringing them in, he said, voice firm. The mother wolf let out a weak growl as he slid his arms beneath her. Her body tensed but didn't resist. It was as if she understood. Easy, girl. I've got you, he whispered. The pups whined, pressing closer. Warren hesitated, then unzipped his heavy coat and tucked them inside against his chest. They trembled, their tiny bodies radiating warmth against his skin. He stood, muscles straining against the weight. The mother wolf was heavier than she looked, her life slipping through his fingers with every second. Gritting his teeth, he started moving. The blizzard chased him, biting at his exposed skin. His legs screamed in protest as he pushed through. Knee-high drifts, the wind slashing against his face. Every step was a battle, but he wouldn't stop. Not now. After what felt like an eternity, the lights of the Wildlife Center glowed through the storm like a beacon. Kara burst through the doors as he stumbled inside, her eyes widening at the sight. "Get the med team! Now!" she shouted. Warren gently lowered the mother wolf onto the examination table, his hands lingering for a fraction longer than necessary. The pups wriggled in his coat, their tiny hearts hammering against his own. "She fought to stay alive for them," he murmured, watching as the team worked quickly. "I couldn't let her fight alone." Kara placed a hand on his shoulder. "Neither could we." As the storm raged outside, the wolves were no longer alone, and for the first time in a long while, Warren wasn't either.